Hello, everyone, and welcome to the September 2025 UCLA Tarjan Center Distinguished Lecture Series. I'm Dr. Yasmin Balarian, Director of Outreach and Dissemination for the Tarjan Center, and it's my pleasure to be here with you today. As we welcome you to our lecture series, we would like to thank and acknowledge our co-sponsors, the UCLA LEND Program, the UCLA Center for Autism Research and Treatment, and the UCLA Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities Research Center. A couple of reminders before we get started. Please enter your questions for our speaker into the Q&A throughout the talk, and we'll facilitate discussion at the end of the presentation. Please also complete our evaluation survey to provide feedback and suggestions for future lectures. The link to the evaluation survey will be sent in the chat today, as well as on a follow-up email this week. As a reminder, captions are available for today's session. To turn them on, go to the Zoom toolbar and click on Show Captions. Then under Caption Language, select your preferred language. I'd now like to introduce our speaker, Dr. Samara Wolpe. She's a neuroaffirming autism researcher and clinician whose work focuses on the transition to adulthood and quality of life for autistic adults. She centers autistic lived experiences to identify practical supports across school, work, and relationships. As a postdoctoral fellow at the UCLA Peers Clinic, Dr. Wolpe leads evidence-based groups on making and keeping friends, dating and navigating romantic relationships, and understanding the social environment of the workplace. Her research translates insights from the autistic community into strategies that help adults pursue their own goals and definitions of success. So please join me in giving a warm virtual welcome to Dr. Samara Wolpe.
All right, hello everyone. Thank you so much to the UCLA Tarjan team for having me. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and we will get started. So today I'm here to talk about my project, Navigating the Transition to Adulthood, Perspective of Autistic Individuals. So starting off, I'm going to start off with a quick language statement. I will be using the identity first language autistic, so autistic person as opposed to person with autism. And I'll be using that throughout this presentation in order to respect and utilize the language preferred by the majority of autistic individuals. Of course, other language, if preferred by autistic individuals, is respected as well. This is just what I'll be using for this presentation. I want to start off by talking about something very pertinent to this presentation, the transition into adulthood. It's a notoriously difficult stage of life for autistic teens and young adults, and it's a difficult stage of life for everyone. We all deal with the typical obstacles of this age group, right? Higher education, finding jobs, navigating friendships, romantic relationships, learning to live away from home for the first time. But autistic individuals also have to transition away from a support system that has been in place their whole lives. And while there are systems in place meant to pick up the slack of these resources, most autistic adults do still experience a sharp decline in resources. There's very little support put in place to help autistic high school students transition into adulthood once they leave this K through 12 educational system. One report found that over half of adults, autistic adults, receives no vocational or life skills training when graduating from high school. And while 97% of autistic teens do receive services in high school of some kind, only 75% report receiving services of any kind during their early 20s. So that's a pretty sharp decline. The same survey found that a third of autistic adults never had a job or continued education after high school, compared to only 8% of peers with learning disabilities, emotional disturbances, or speech and language impairments. And the disconnect between these rates is very startling, and it begs the question of why some autistic adults are finding themselves so disconnected with these early stages of adulthood. Overall, the majority of studies find poor to very poor outcomes in independent living, rate of employment, and friendship quality and quantity. And these categories may not encompass the entirety of success as defined by the autistic individual in their own life, but they are a jumping off point with which to examine the experiences of autistic adults who transition out of high school and into adulthood. And we'll be talking more about those outcomes in a few minutes. So we'll start with the literature review. As I said, measuring success can be a little tricky. Most autism research conducted on outcomes in autistic adults have found that this community has poor to very poor outcomes in adulthood. And this is measured with varying definitions and different measurements. It is important to note that studies examining these outcomes tend to use criteria that conforms to a neurotypical standard of success, and these measures can vary greatly between studies. For example, Howland and colleagues in 2004 developed a commonly used outcome measure for success in adulthood called the Overall Outcome Rating Scale, which is based on categories of independence such as independent living, friendship, and occupational domains. And while these goals may be in line with the goal of the individual and their family for the future, many autistic individuals may define success along different axes. And only a subset of this research demonstrates high methodological quality, as these outcome measures were not normed with the input of autistic adults. There are also some concerns with sampling bias, as the majority of these studies are not representative, instead, consisting of a cohort of intervention subjects and data pulled from a subset of participants rather than a nationally representative sample. Some research has also indicated that these poor outcomes may be more closely tied to individual characteristics such as verbal IQ, rather than the presence or absence of an autism diagnosis. And while this literature review will proceed to discuss some of these measures of success in adulthood using this research, I do want to emphasize that it's important to interpret these statistics and outcomes mentioned today here with caution. And that brings us to this study. So, as a result of the limitations of these outcome measures, a qualitative exploration of autistic adults' own perspectives of their experiences transitioning into adulthood, what they perceive to be positive and negative experiences and outcomes in their own lives, is very important to gain an understanding of where intervention science can focus their efforts to be in alignment with the community that we all hope to serve. So I want to talk about employment. Again, we will be talking about these outcome measures, despite, there being some difficulties with them. Employment prospects for autistic adults are reported to be particularly low, even when compared with individuals with developmental disabilities such as Down syndrome. And furthermore, those who find jobs tend to work for part-time or low wages. A meta-analysis has found that between 20 to 55% of autistic adults ever obtained paid employment, with another study finding that 55% of autistic adults had never worked or were long-term unemployed. Again, a pretty broad statistic, so we see some of the difficulty in accurately measuring these things. And while there are certainly factors internal to the individual to maybe explain this disparity in employment outcomes in some cases, employer prejudice plays a huge role in discriminatory hiring practices. One study found that 1 in 5 employers rated autistic candidates as having poor social skills, and that affected their decision of whether or not to hire. And although employment rates for autistic adults are low, autistic adults have unique strengths that can be enormous assets to the workplace. There are many to speak of, but some of them are that on average, autistic adults tend to be more tolerant of repetitive work. They display more dependability and adherence to rules compared with neurotypical employees. However, employers tend to value traits such as self-advocacy and confidence when seeking employment, especially in interviews. And these traits can be difficult for many autistic adults to display in unfamiliar or uncomfortable professional settings. And as a result, autistic candidates face a real disadvantage both in the hiring process and the workplace. I also want to discuss higher education. The majority of autistic adults do not attend higher education, with only 36% of autistic young adults attending post-secondary education between high school and their early 20s. And this includes two-year colleges and vocational education. The same report found that only 11% of respondents attended a 4-year college, compared with 38% in the general population, so less than half of that percentage. And among those who did attend college, there are numerous barriers to success. Accommodations are often difficult to receive, as requiring accommodations requires paperwork, contact with disability offices, and willingness to disclose one's diagnosis and accommodations to every TA, every professor, every college employee over and over again. Of autistic students who did choose to disclose their identity, only 42% received accommodations. So that indicates that it's not just the choice to disclose, there are more steps along this process that can be challenging. And this is Difficulty because college is a prerequisite for many high-paying jobs, meaning that low college success rates can be a potential contributor to poor employment rates. And furthermore, difficulties obtaining accommodations paired with difficulties with executive functioning, as well as poor physical and mental health rates, add barriers to navigating college as an autistic adult. So there are many barriers here that make higher education a daunting task, specifically for autistic adults. I also want to touch on the role of intersectional identities. Non white autistic individuals tend to be identified less frequently than white individuals, with several studies finding that white students are up to twice as likely to be identified as autistic compared with their non white counterpoints. And furthermore, non white autistic children were less likely to receive a variety of healthcare services, from GI treatment, GI issues being a common struggle in autistic youth, to neurological and psychiatric care. And this lack of early identification and receipt of needed services, of course, has serious implications down the line into development in adulthood, given that early intervention is strongly associated with improved developmental trajectory. And the same goes for early health intervention, physical health. These consequences can be illustrated in poor outcomes in the measures that we discussed for non-white and low SES autistic adults, who are less likely to be successful in all of these metrics that we've been talking about: education, employment, independent living, fulfilling social lives, and service receipt. Gender also plays a huge role, as female and gender nonconforming individuals are also identified less frequently than males in childhood. This may be due in part to the role of gender-based behavioral expectation for girls, as girls are theorized to be better at masking or covering up, any unusual behaviors, and they are held to lower standards of academic achievement compared with boys of the same age. And as a result, women are often understudied in autism research, and in particular, women with intersectional identities, especially Black women and girls. And the full consequences of racial and gender and ethnic disparities in identification, support, and service receipt among autistic individuals is not something we can fully understand because not enough people are studying it. In more recent years, it started to become more of a topic of discussion, but these clear inequities in diagnosis and services put this already vulnerable population at increased risk as they navigate this transition. These consequences are also especially evidenced in the fact that autistic and gender diverse or LGBTQ plus individuals experience poorer health outcomes in adulthood compared to autistic and cisgender straight adults. These findings demonstrate a critical need to involve a more diverse sample of autistic participants with various intersectional identities in this research. I want to talk a little bit about the theoretical framework that I used for this study. So I started off with the social model of disability, which is a framework that examines disability through the lens of societal exclusion and accommodation, examining the way that our economic, our social, and value structures promote ableism. And this model stands in contrast to the medical model of disability, or the more traditional idea that disability should be viewed as an often undesirable deviation from an aspirational standard of health. It also indicates that disability is something inherent to the individual rather than imposed on the individual by a societal structure. Related to the social model of disability, autism advocates have promoted the concept of neurodiversity, or the idea that neurological differences, such as autism, can be considered part of the natural range of human development. And neurodiversity encompasses many types of cognitive and behavioral differences that occur naturally in a population, but it's often used in autism advocacy to promote the idea of autism as a natural state of being to be embraced by society instead of demarcated as a disability or disorder. And neurodiversity encourages those in academia and other positions of power to listen to the voices of the community, with the neurodiversity movement's unofficial slogan, "Nothing about us without us." And autism research in line with this neurodiversity movement and with the social model of disability will be community partnered, involve autistic participants and collaborators, and will not have the goal of changing autistic individuals or suppressing their inherent characteristics, but will use the knowledge from the community to improve opportunities and outcomes for autistic individuals and the broader neurodiverse community. So that brings us to our current study. Only about 3.5% of published research focuses on autistic adults, with an even smaller percentage of funding being allocated to this research. So it's a very understudied area of autistic individuals. And given the poor outcomes in adulthood for autistic individuals across nearly every metric, there is a critical need for research that examines this transition. And furthermore, there's a call for research centering autistic individuals and their experiences. So, therefore, the current study focuses on the experience of autistic individuals transitioning out of high school and into adulthood. And we did that through a series of qualitative interviews with autistic adults. And the goal of the study is to conduct this study with the hope of understanding some of these invisible barriers that we're talking about: barriers to education, barriers to employment, barriers to quality of life for autistic individuals. And we want to look at all these metrics and see, how do autistic individuals assess their own happiness and their own quality of life? And what do they recommend? How can we support them better? So that brings us to our research questions. My first research question was, what are the barriers of autistic individuals that they encounter in the transition to adult life? With the sub-question of examining barriers in higher education and in employment. I also looked at what resources autistic individuals find most helpful in navigating this transition, what families, organizations, employers, and educators can do to support autistic adults transitioning into adulthood, what strategies for success participants can recommend to other autistic emerging youth to help navigate this tricky transition into adulthood. And lastly, what does success mean to autistic individuals in their own lives? What matters to them? I also want to discuss my positionality. I am not autistic. I am a family member of an autistic individual. I have worked for over a decade in the autism community in various settings as a teacher, a behavioral aide, a researcher, a clinician. And while most participants were unknown to me prior to the study, several of the participants interviewed had a personal connection with me, as I worked for several years at an organization where these individuals took classes. I did take steps to mitigate potential biases or pressures that might occur from this connection, and I'll talk about that more as we go on. But I do believe that this prior connection improved the interviews through trust and familiarity with the life experiences of our participants, as well as their increased comfort levels with me. Moving on to methods. 18 autistic adults, ages 18 and over, were interviewed. For the purposes of this project, participants over the age of 40 were excluded from analysis, leaving a total of 17 participants. This choice was made due to the desire to focus on the experiences of autistic young adults in the current state of the job market, the educational system, and the social environment, as these things do change fairly quickly. Participants were recruited primarily through social media and secondarily through an organization that I mentioned before that specializes in facilitating careers in the entertainment industry for autistic individuals. When I was recruiting in this organization, all recruitment emails were sent through third parties in the organization to ensure that participants felt comfortable not responding, declining, or asking questions about the project that they might not be comfortable asking me or the primary investigator. Social media recruitment was conducted through Instagram by creating an autism research account and posting the IRB approved flyers to the account. Initial recruitment was conducted via email, and if they were interested in learning more or potentially engaging with the study, they were instructed to make contact with that email address to learn more. Those who indicated their interest were provided with a consent form to review, along with a Google survey to determine their eligibility by asking if participants were autistic adults aged 18 or over. The survey also collected demographic information from eligible participants, such as their primary language, ethnicity, age, type of high school attended, and the presence or absence of an autism diagnosis or self-identification as autistic. We conducted Zoom interviews between 30 and 60 minutes, and these were recorded for later analysis. Demographic information for participants is displayed on this slide. Pseudonyms were assigned for each participant, and I will be referring to their quotes in the results section according to the pseudonyms listed. Some salient statistics to note is that the sample was majority female at 53%, which is unusual for an autism participation sample. There was also a significant number of non-binary and gender non-conforming individuals at 17.6%, and the sample was majority white at 53%. And lastly, the majority of participants attended a mainstream high school, spoke English, and had an autism diagnosis as opposed to self-identification as autistic. In terms of materials, we used Google Forms for our demographic surveys as well as our follow-ups, and we used Zoom for the interviews and recordings. Interview protocol was developed to ascertain quality of life skills preparation received, and the most helpful and harmful aspects of preparation experiences for adulthood. All of the Zoom interviews were conducted through Zoom and recorded, and the transcripts were subsequently edited and anonymized. Before participants began, participants were provided with studies protocols and their rights as participants. Prior to filling out the eligibility form, participants were asked to review the consent form and ask any questions about it prior to the interview. Additionally, time was made during each interview before the reporting began to answer any questions or concerns that participants had about the interview. Time was made to review the consent form if they wished and to explain the purpose of the study. Everyone was asked about their comfort level with being recorded, and verbal consent was obtained before proceeding with the interview. Every participant was told that they could stop the interview at any time, take breaks, or turn off their cameras if they felt overwhelmed or uncomfortable. They were also given the right to withdraw their interview or edit their transcripts at any time. Member checking was used before publicizing any results from the study to ensure that participants felt their voices were accurately represented, and also to give them a chance to change, withdraw, or add their quotes. So this was open to everyone. All the participants were permitted to withdraw anything or change anything that they said prior to publication. And they were also sent a thank you email after the interview and invited to complete an optional post-interview survey. All of the recordings and transcripts of the interview were stored on a secure password-protected online server, and access to the server is restricted to staff who had been approved by the IRB. All transcripts were de-identified by the research team prior to data analysis, and pseudonyms were assigned for all participants. The data analysis followed the guidelines for thematic analysis proposed by Braun and Clark. I used an iterative and inductive approach to code the data and identify recurring themes. The first round of analysis involved multiple read-throughs of each transcript, during which I noted recurring sentiments and ideas. I did this several times and used reflexive journaling to note any biases or personal thoughts that came up for me as I coded these transcripts. And through this process of reflexive journaling and familiarizing myself with the data, I arrived at preliminary codes, which were ideas or sentiments that kept coming up over and over. Upon multiple read-throughs, I then organized the codes into an dynamically evolving code book, and a frequency table of each code's occurrence in the transcript were generated, and we used the software Deduce to facilitate the analysis of the data. After this process happened, I continued to revisit the transcripts until themes formed from these codes. I also used a systematic coding consensus procedure proposed by Wilms and colleagues to ensure reliability and consistency. I worked with a research assistant to ensure inter-rater reliability. This research assistant coded 100% of the transcripts separately. Then we met to come to consensus. We assessed fidelity. We compared codes and discussed the discrepancies until a minimum of 80% agreement was reached. Moving on to the results, data analysis yielded several overarching themes: educational and vocational experiences after graduation, barriers to success, what worked to promote success at this life stage, and recommendations to various people and institutions that could promote better outcomes in future generations. I was actually surprised, despite the variation between participants and their different life experiences, how many had really experienced very similar struggles in this transition, and how many had arrived completely independently at very similar paths to success. Each of these themes contains sub-themes, so the bolded themes are our major themes, and the sub-themes are not bolded, and we will get into each of those. Starting off with educational and vocational experiences. So, not all of our participants attended college, but for those who did attend college, participants had mixed experiences of accommodations and service experiences. Some had positive experiences, but many more had negative experiences and talked about how difficult it was to navigate disability offices at their universities. One participant, Rebecca, who was late diagnosed with ADHD as well as autism, explained that each step of obtaining accommodations was a significant challenge for someone like her who has executive functioning challenges, and each step placed additional barriers before her. For some participants, those barriers were so significant that they had to drop out of college. Others relied on masking to appear as neurotypical and tried to avoid using any accommodations at all. Several participants also shared experiences of trying to pursue accommodations in a work environment. Nina, who's a young woman who works in an organization who supports autistic youth, shares that her organization, which is supportive in theory and publicly boasts a very neuroaffirming and accessible work environment, would in private frequently forget her and her coworkers' accommodations, causing them to overwork and experience burnout. Participants also discussed the importance of routines and the resistance to change as they transitioned into this new phase of adulthood, and this is well cataloged, both in experiences of autistic individuals and in research. Major life changes like moving away from home or going to college, transitioning out of high school, getting a job, it causes anxiety for everyone, but especially for autistic individuals who many of them are very reliant on routines. And as these routines shift, unexpected experiences arise, it can be very stressful. And many participants, unsurprisingly, reported difficulty adjusting to the new environment, whether they be in college or working or even moving to a new living arrangement. Many reported wishing that they had more flexibility to adjust to the change, as well as more support from their institution, their families, and the people around them. They also discussed masking to a large extent. Masking, or the act of camouflaging or parts of oneself, suppressing behaviors around others, has the goal of conformity or social acceptance. And it was frequently brought up as a topic among participants. Autistic young adults reported engaging in masking behavior for a variety of scenarios and motivations, but most often in the workplace. And while many felt that masking was a necessity for maintaining jobs and professional relationships, they reported that the cost was very high and it was not always effective. Masking wasn't just explained as a behavior developed to fit in while trying to succeed in a professional setting. Many autistic adults explained that they learned masking at a young age to please their teachers, their family members, or to fit in with other kids. And this behavior often intersected with cultural considerations. So, Sam, in particular, I want to highlight their quote. They're a young filmmaker who received a late in life autism diagnosis. And they explained that they learned masking as a child to please their parents and to avoid shame, embarrassment, or punishment, saying, quote, "My family's Mexican. I grew up not knowing the most about mental health. It's not something that was talked about or really understood. We had to do well in school. That was our responsibility. And so when I started to struggle, I knew that if I was struggling, I wasn't going to get help. I was going to get reprimanded or hit." I really appreciate this quote because I think it illustrates the actual real lived consequences of failing to mask in childhood, as well as the potential toll that it can take to learn and maintain these behaviors into adulthood, especially as the stakes continue to be high, right? In childhood, it was Sam masked to make sure that they were maintaining the support of their family. In adulthood, Sam and other participants masked to ensure that they wouldn't get fired, that they wouldn't be kicked out of school, that they wouldn't be kicked out of social groups. So the toll of masking is very high, and the consequences of not masking are similarly high. When it came to barriers to success, financial literacy, as well as the lack of finances, was often expressed as a major barrier to adulthood success. For instance, keeping and maintaining a job is challenging for many autistic adults and really for everyone at times. Although they often do so to stay afloat financially. And this could force participants to stay in work environments that were untenable for them. And while many young adults express a lack of understanding around matters of financial literacy, autistic adults have been found to have lower financial literacy than the average population and more uncertainty around finances. Alex, who is an actor, songwriter, and Halloween Horror Nights employee. I promised them that I would always include the Halloween Horror Nights employee in any presentation I gave. They lamented, quote, "Suddenly I have to do paperwork. Suddenly I'm financially responsible," unquote. And I think part of the disorientation is due to the way autistic teens can traditionally be treated as younger than their age. And this is in part due to infantilization. Autistic adults are traditionally infantilized, even with psychiatric professionals traditionally conceiving of autistic people as childlike. And many participants expressed feelings of frustration at this, at being presumed incompetent, as being treated younger than their real age. Participants described parents babying them and other adults treating them as if they were younger than they were. And this attitude of infantilization followed participants beyond school and beyond their homes into adulthood, where the protections of childhood were removed without that proper instruction on how to navigate an adult world. At the same time, despite these barriers set in place, autistic adults have a right to presumed confidence and shouldn't be forced to accept help that they don't need. And participants emphasized that offering support is not the same as presuming incompetence, and at the same time, that silence does not imply ignorance. Participants made clear that the support they wanted was the support that they asked for, and the goal here is always maximum independence with important and needed support being offered free of stigma. Among the participants, there was a pervasive feeling that their struggles had been and would be met with ignorance and indifference. Participants reported indifference on the part of their employers, with employers ignoring accommodations, accusing them of being lazy, even when they were working as hard as they could. As Maddie, a fiction writer and former convenience store employee, explained, quote, "Sometimes I get overwhelmed and I need a minute." And they were the type of employer that was like, "Okay, but that's all an excuse. You're being lazy." They were of the mind that if your disability was not a physical one, then you didn't have one, unquote. While participants reported receiving love and support from family and friends, they also recounted numerous instances of being met with indifference and cruelty from people in positions of power. And these are people who could have made different choices. These are people who could have taken the time to understand, to be kind, and to help. Most participants in this study were highly verbal, and many received late in life diagnoses of autism. As a result, most of the participants were labeled as having, quote, low support needs, in contrast to autistic individuals with lower verbal abilities or maybe those who need more supportive services. Participants frequently expressed the sentiment that they fell into a sort of unsteady, mild to moderate needs category, where services were either inappropriate to their needs or not offered for people who did not display higher levels of service requirements. In addition to the lack of services for many of the participants' level of need, several participants discussed the role of masking in causing their existing service needs to be overlooked. So Kyle, who is accepted to graduate school and is currently working with a neurodivergent advisor in his PhD program, explained that he was, quote, able to mask so well that I was just able to place myself out of special education services because I could blend in like a neurotypical person. But then coming to grad school and being more accepting of my autism and learning more about it, I'm realizing I need some accommodations. Despite many of their hopes that college would provide a different landscape for making friends, sensory overwhelm was frequently in conflict with participants' desires to meet new people and form friendships. Even when friendships were made, participants reported running into frequent conflicts and difficulties navigating unspoken social violations. College socialization also does require a certain degree of masking or conforming one's behavior to a conventional standard, as many, school environments and other social environments do. And Nina found this challenging, saying, quote, socially, I felt like I wasn't picking up on cues. I would sit down with my friend and it seemed like they just didn't want me to be there. Or I wasn't invited to a party and stuff, and I felt like people were leaving me out and I felt like I was being annoying to them. Most participants who attended college reported struggling with the social climate in the school, but some participants had positive experiences, particularly those who bonded over shared interests or common interests. Importantly, despite their struggles to forge relationships in a college setting, all of the participants expressed valuing friendships, which is really critical. They all wanted friendships, it was just challenging. The intricacies of unspoken societal expectations followed participants into the workplace, unsurprisingly, where many were met with confusion at having accidentally violated certain workplace rules of decorum. Unwritten social rules are often not evident to autistic individuals and are often learned through painful trial and error. Even when certain social faux pas didn't result in termination, and some did, that participants reported. Participants still reported that their coworkers often became uncomfortable around them, suspicious, or even outright hostile. Emily, who went through several unsuccessful job placements before returning to school to work on teaching theater to neurodivergent youth, shared, quote, people just automatically know there's something off about you, that you're a little weird and you do things very rigidly. And they're like, huh, she's weird. I don't know how I feel about this. And then they kind of like backhandedly bully you. The unspoken expectations of a workplace environment includes a thorough, detailed, and mandatory social script that applies to a plethora of situations. And they're not posted at the door at these workplaces, right? While those who are equipped with this social script may not think twice about it and it may come very automatically, many autistic employees are at a disadvantage for not being taught these skills explicitly before starting a new job. I also want to discuss burnout and meltdown. So, this was frequently raised as a real barrier to success by participants. Autistic burnout, in particular, is a phenomenon described by autistic adults that consists of exhaustion, incapacitation, and loss of functioning. And this can be really debilitating for the individual. Participants frequently described autistic burnout or meltdown as a real barrier in achieving success. And even daily living tasks were adversely affected by this meltdown. Emily, who described being fired due to the effects of burnout, describes her experience as an overflowing of emotion under pressure. And while not all participants were fired due to this burnout, it almost always led to some penalty or negative consequence. During this time, participants felt that they were unable to keep their head above water in their jobs, their daily lives, and some struggled to take care of themselves during an episode of burnout. Time and practice, by the time I had talked to participants, most of the time they had figured out how to sort of handle this part of themselves and to organize their lives in such a way as to prevent feelings of burnout from becoming overwhelming. For some people, that was not doing a 40-hour work week. That just didn't work for them. For others, it was working specific hours. For others, it was requesting accommodations like needing, a cubicle to themselves or headphones. It was different for every person, but almost all of them had to go through that process of trial and error in order to figure out how to create a sustainable work environment for themselves. Many participants also discussed executive functioning as a common challenge. Although difficulties can vary across individuals, common executive functioning challenges include cognitive flexibility, phonemic flexibility, and working memory. So, executive functioning can be thought of as sort of how we organize our lives, right? Remembering to do tasks, being on time to things, completing assignments. These are all executive functioning tasks. Many participants described struggling with poor executive functioning skills and feeling that the pace of college or employment was just too fast to keep up, that they were always struggling to keep their heads above water, and it just was like constantly treading water. Internal struggles when comparing themselves to other students and employees were really common, especially among those who had not yet received an autism diagnosis and wondered, sometimes despairingly, why they weren't able to keep up with their peers. And other people were handling it without difficulty. Why were they struggling? And while autistic adults may struggle with executive functioning in ways that affect their work and education, that doesn't mean they're destined to be incapable of succeeding. There are ways around this. Teaching study skills explicitly, rather than assuming that they're imbibed through osmosis in high school, can be really critical in promoting successful outcomes for this community. And they can be successful. There are dedicated future students and workers that, want to have these strategies, that need these strategies. Many participants expressed fear of discrimination surrounding disclosing their autism diagnosis or autistic identity, and this was often dependent on regional or cultural stigmas. Sam recalled fearing that their family, who is Mexican and whose cultural norms discourage openness around certain mental health struggles, would find out that they were struggling, like we discussed earlier. Several participants decided not to disclose their autistic identity, even to accommodations departments, resulting in them struggling during college and early career without needed support. And even for those who did disclose their autistic identity to disability service offices, it doesn't just happen once, right? You need to disclose again and again and again to every professor, every teaching assistant. And this was seen as a huge burden. It's heavy, it's ongoing, and many participants did feel fear around disclosing. But despite this, most of them agreed that being open about their autistic identity was really important, not only for living their lives with authenticity and with honesty, but also for representation and being there for other autistic adults. So, moving on to my favorite general theme, what works for autistic adults? Our first and most frequently discussed theme was acceptance and unlearning ableism. Most participants recalled working to unlearn that internalized stigma on the path to self acceptance. This involved learning how to unmask, learning how to conceal aspects of oneself from, or unconceal aspects of oneself from other people, and how to embrace those parts of themselves that they once worked really hard to repress. That was a key aspect of almost every participant's journey into adulthood. And self acceptance was almost universally touted as the path to happiness and the avenue through which participants really allowed themselves to embrace their full potential and pursue careers in their area of interest. Appreciating the strengths that come with having a mind that works differently than a neurotypical mind was a really key step for many in arriving at that self acceptance, and even actually going beyond that and celebrating their ways of being in the world. For many, part of that unlearning stigma around autism and ableism at large was to understand that it wasn't the autistic individual that was necessarily wrong or needed to change to fit in, but the world that maybe wasn't as accommodating to the incredible people and diversity that it contained. And that was mentioned by almost every participant in a huge part of their journeys. Along that road to self acceptance, finding community was a huge aspect of embracing themselves and their autistic identities. Nina, who's really active in her autistic community and advocacy groups, explains that autistic community is an invaluable part of her support system. She shared, autistic social support groups are valuable to me because they understand my little quirks, and sometimes I'll make little noises and jokes, and they'll just be like, ah, I get you. I understand why you're doing that. Having my neurodivergent friends, it's fun. Autistic social groups were described by many participants as safe spaces where they could unmask. They wouldn't be moving through the world as a representative of the autistic community, sort of bound to be in that role. Instead, they could just relax and express themselves without the restraints that are typically imposed by neurotypical society. That journey to self-acceptance and unlearning ableism was taken for participants, for many, through building autistic community, meeting other peers they admired and appreciated, and with whom they found those reciprocal, accepting friendships. So that was really important. Participants just talked about how they felt constantly confused, told to conceal aspects of themselves, and discriminated against in their lives and in their worlds. So finding community of acceptance and freedom to be who they actually were, it wasn't just essential, it was joyful. It was the part of their lives that brought meaning. Individual attention and mentorship, which is critical for development really for everyone, was touted as one of the key supports appreciated by participants. And this could be anyone from family members to teachers to counselors, just one individual who really saw the participant, cared about their well-being, took a vested interest in their progress. That was really what made a huge difference in their trajectories. They expressed that they felt more competent, ready to take on new challenges, and navigate unprecedented situations equipped with thoughtful and understanding mentors. And they suggested that mentorship for autistic young adults should stretch beyond the typical career or academic oriented mentorship. It could be to anything, life coaching, personal mentorship, anything as long as that person was understanding and dedicated to helping them succeed. Moving on to our next theme, all right, we'll move through this a little bit fast because we're running low on time, but finding their strengths was critical. Finding special interests and finding a way to turn that into a sustainable career path was critical. Having that passion, having that interest was what made their careers worthwhile. And it didn't have to be a career. It could be a volunteer position. It could be anything that let them practice that interest in real life. People also discussed alternative pathways. So, going to community college rather than a 4-year school, taking a gap year, having those life experiences and not taking a traditional path was discussed as a much more helpful and, an alternative that allowed people some breathing room in their journey to adulthood and ultimately led to greater success and comfort. So lastly, we'll discuss recommendations. The key recommendations for high school was to teach financial literacy and to teach study strategies, as well as to teach some psychoeducation for families. So equipping people with those executive functioning skills, equipping them with financial literacy, and then sending them into adulthood with those strategies instead of just teaching content. For college recommendations, participants recommended a universal design, learning design classroom, and also a menu option of accommodation. So in classrooms, having more options instead of just saying you must do a group project, have them be able to choose. Maybe they can make an audio-visual presentation. Maybe they can write an essay. Maybe they can give an oral presentation, depending on their style of learning. And in terms of accommodations, instead of walking into an accommodations office and being asked, what accommodations do you need? Instead, accommodations officers offering them a menu of accommodations where maybe they can circle or have a list. That would be more helpful because then they wouldn't have to do all the burden of advocating for themselves, of trying to come up with what they needed wouldn't be on them. And lastly, job recommendations, just listening to accommodations, providing those accommodations, and also providing neurodiversity education for employers, for coworkers, just so that they wouldn't, autistic participants wouldn't experience so much discrimination in the workplace, and so that they wouldn't experience burnout as frequently. For families, education about neurodiversity, support, and transparency. So some participants reported that their families didn't tell them that they were autistic and that having that knowledge would have really helped in their journey to self-acceptance and understanding their strengths. And teaching that self-acceptance in childhood. So, as a parent, teaching that who they are is a wonderful thing, celebrating their uniqueness, celebrating their strengths instead of always trying to focus on deficits or struggles. And lastly, for autistic young adults, planning for the future and finding that special interest, finding a mentor that will help guide them through this process was critical. And most importantly, finding friendship and community in neurodivergent community and with others with common interests. And if you can't find that, create your own place, right? So Catherine recommended create your own club if you can't find a social club to join based around your interest. And lastly, self-acceptance, being patient, not comparing yourself to others. Participants encouraged autistic young adults to understand their strengths and to see that having a neurotypical mind has drawbacks as well, right? All human beings have strengths and weaknesses. And participants encouraged other autistic adults to think of themselves as a person like anyone else, deserving of patience and of love. All right, wrapping up, the goal of so one key takeaway is a toll of masking, and this discussion of that based on context. So, masking can be important for the workplace, but it also is a real barrier if it's being kept up all the time, right? Maintaining that constant mask is exhausting and it leads to burnout. So thinking of how we can change our workplaces, thinking of how we can change our places of education so that there are places where autistic adults can feel safe unmasking, whether that's neurodivergent community or psychoeducation for coworkers and employers, so that autistic adults are not always placed with the burden of meeting neurotypical employees where they're at. Maybe they can meet somewhere in the middle, right? Accommodations, so offering open accommodations or a menu option of accommodations instead of just requesting individual accommodations, and examining most useful resources. So we can look into more of what is the most useful accommodation that people utilize in the workplace. What's the most useful thing that they can utilize in college? And lastly, finding that self-acceptance, community education to increase that understanding and building strong support networks. The study has a few limitations. I'll just zoom through those quickly. Generalizability, these were just 18 individuals or 17 individuals. Autistic individuals have very different experiences. It was a very homogeneous sample. The sample was majority white and highly verbal. Non-white non-white autistic individuals, and nonverbal or non-speaking and less speaking autistic individuals may have very different experiences. And lastly, I'm not autistic. This study was not co-designed with autistic individuals, although autistic individuals did come in and help with analysis and write-up. But still, future studies should be co-designed with autistic individuals to guarantee that we are measuring what we want to measure and aiding the autistic community as much as we can. So for some future directions, continuing to pursue perspectives of autistic individuals, involving autistic researchers at every step, maybe having community advisory boards, and also offering alternatives to Zoom for accessibility and to broaden participant diversity. And lastly, offering a broader array of recruitment avenues to ensure a more balanced representation. And I know we're running low on time, but if you want to learn more, we do have a paper out specifically about the importance of neurodivergent community. There's a QR code there, and we also have another paper coming out soon in the Journal of Autism and Developmental Disorders, specifically about life skills preparation. So what was most helpful for autistic participants as they navigated the transition to adulthood, what families did, what high schools did that was helpful and less helpful. All right. So thank you so much. I really appreciate you all being here, and thank you for listening.
Thank you, Dr. Wolpe, for this informative and practical talk on supporting autistic young adults in the transition to adulthood. I really appreciated all of the useful strategies that you shared, from navigating higher education and employment barriers to building community and self-acceptance and sustainable pathways for success. We'll now transition to the Q&A portion of our webinar. We appreciate the thoughtful questions and comments that we've been receiving from the audience. One person commented that much of what you reported from interviews really speaks to their own experiences and those of other people that they know. So clearly your talk is resonating with many people on this call. We'll keep the Q&A box open, so please continue to submit as we go. But many of the questions that we received were about resources and strategies. So one person asked, my child is 14. What tips can you share for the upcoming years?
That's a great question. And 14 is a wonderful age because we actually see that states that start transition preparation at age 14 rather than 16 lead to much better outcomes in employment, in wages, even down the line. So you're starting at the perfect time. I think there are a few critical things that can be really helpful at this stage. First of all, it's never too soon to start teaching financial literacy, independent living skills, all of those things, just the strategies of life, because you never know, I don't know whether, you yourself are neurotypical, neurodivergent, autistic, but all of our minds work differently, and you never know what you might think is, intuitive that your child might just not have gotten. And that's true for all of us, right? So teaching those life skills early. And also, if you can, I don't know if you have an IEP or if your child has an IEP or a 504 plan or some other accommodations plan, but trying to incorporate transition planning as early as possible into that plan, I think is a really strong idea. And if it's accessible to you and it's not offered by your school, you can pursue like some kind of, transition preparation coaching, or you can pursue some other like executive functioning coaching outside of that. And also starting to think about, what are your child's interests? Do they have particular interests? Even things that you may think are not things that can lead to a career. If you work with a good transition preparation coach, they may be able to sort of work those interests into something that could end up being something that's your child is passionate about in adulthood and gives them a career, gives them meaningful work. So I think that those are the things that immediately come to mind. But you're asking at the perfect time.
Thank you. You mentioned transition planning. Our next question is actually from a family support specialist at a family resource center who says, we're trying to build our resources to help those transitioning from high school, but there's not much out there. Are there any available resources you would suggest us looking into for post high school?
Yeah, I mean, it's tough because there are not a lot of great resources. I mean, I think it depends what kind of resources. If you're thinking about colleges, I always recommend advising people to go to community college first. In the many autistic young adults that I've spoken to, not just in the study, but in my time working in the community college was almost always a much better and stronger educational and social experience than a 4-year college. And that's not to say you can't transition to a 4-year college after that, but many autistic adults develop along a different trajectory and may need a little bit more time at home, or learning those life skills, or maybe really ahead academically, or in another area, right? So that's sort of like huge strengths, right, as well. And I think that community college offers that flexibility. 4-year colleges are a very strict timeline. Community college allows you to sort of build your own curriculum. If you're not thinking about college, then I would say, I mean, vocational skills are kind or vocational schools are kind of hit or miss from what I've heard. There are, some good programs out there. I can't really think of any in the moment, but if you follow up with me, I'm happy to look for resources and send you some. I would also look to autistic self-advocacy networks because a lot of their resources are vetted by individuals who've used them, who know, whether they're good or not. So I would say don't take my word for it, go straight to the source and ask the people who've actually experienced them.
Thank you, Dr. Wolpe. I'll also put a plug in for the UCLA Tarjan Center website. We have a page under our resources that highlights some of the specific college programs and organizations that support people with developmental disabilities. And so this is not an exhaustive list, but it, hopefully will serve as a nice tool to support students, families, and professionals with some of what's available out there. Um, okay, so the next question asks, you noted that many participants in your study had lower support needs. In your work or the broader literature, do studies typically distinguish between lower and higher support needs? And if so, what differences show up in findings or recommendations?
That's a great question. I would say that in research in an autistic adulthood, most studies focus on those with lower support needs. That's for a couple reasons. Mostly that it's easier for researchers. It's more difficult to get the perspective and to find people who want to participate who have lower support needs. And the trajectory is very different. Think people with lower support needs may have different needs, different desires, or, be following different developmental trajectories. That's not to say that there shouldn't be more research in, individuals with lower support needs. There absolutely should. And their perspectives are critical, and that's not an excuse to say that their perspectives shouldn't be taken into account. Um, I would say that it's measured along different lines. Sometimes there's an IQ cutoff, sometimes there's a verbal ability cutoff. It depends on the study. I didn't have any cutoff in my study. Anyone who wanted to participate was welcome, but the format of the study itself was exclusionary, right? Like a Zoom interview. I allowed people to bring aides or interpreters or anything that they wanted, but it was also about where I recruited, right? So common recruitment for qualitative studies happens on social media. Again, people with lower support needs are more likely to be active on social media. Not to say that's exclusive, that's a big generalization, but that's just what tends to happen. So I think future studies examining, individuals with higher support needs could look at, maybe different at recruiting in different avenues. And in terms of the trajectories and resources used, I mean, it really depends on the individual. There are many individuals with higher support needs who are attending four-year universities, who are full-time employee. It kind of just depends on the person. And also, even using the term higher and lower support needs is a little bit tricky because every individual is so unique that their support needs may not be descriptive of, their capabilities and their interests in their adulthood. So It's tough to say. I hope that answered your question. I'm not sure if it did.
Thank you so much, Dr. Wolpe. I think with that, I will start to wrap us up here. Again, appreciate you sharing such an insightful and practical presentation. We appreciate the way you mentioned both the challenges and the strengths and strategies that can really make a difference for autistic young adults during the transition to adulthood. Thank you to everyone who joined us today. As a reminder, please be sure to complete our feedback survey, the link to which can be found in the chat and will also be sent via email as well. We hope the information and resources shared will be useful to your own work and to your communities. We also wanted to take a minute to share out on our upcoming Tarjan Center Forum and Neurodevelopmental Disabilities on Friday, October 24th. So, this free online conference features a keynote from Pete Travanka, the director of the California Department of Developmental Services, a panel on employment for people with intellectual and neurodevelopmental disabilities, as well as sessions on dating and sexuality for autistic people, the long term course of autism, and evidence based communication strategies. So, for details and registration, please visit our website or find the UCLA Tarjan Center on social media. Thanks again, and we hope to see you there.